Good evening. Welcome. I am Dr. Antonio Ugas Jr., Director of the Center, Director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at St. Mary's College of Maryland, the National Public Honors College. I would like to open our program by offering an example of how St. Mary's College continues to work toward acknowledging the truth in our history. We acknowledge that the land on which we are learning, working, and gathering today is the ancestral home of the Yococomiko and Piscataway peoples. We also acknowledge that St. Mary's City was partly built and sustained by enslaved people of African descent. Through this acknowledgement, we recognize these communities and all those who have been displaced and enslaved through colonization. Given the unique importance of the land on which we sit, and given the unique educational mission of St. Mary's College of Maryland as the National Public Honors College, we pledge to continue to unearth and understand these historic realities so that they inform all of our work. We also pledge to work tirelessly in making our institution more accessible, inclusive, and equitable, especially for those populations most affected by societal inequities. We do this with the understanding that by supporting and learning from all of our diverse communities, we build a more sustainable future for all. On behalf of the Center for the Study of Democracy, a joint partnership of St. Mary's College of Maryland and historic St. Mary's City, it is my honor to welcome you to the 2024 Judge William O.E. Sterling Constitution Day Lecture. The Constitution Day Lecture is an annual event held on or around September 17th to commemorate and celebrate the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. The lecture also serves to commemorate the legacy of Judge Sterling, a distinguished attorney, judge, and a founding member of the St. Mary's County Bar Association. This year, we are fortunate that we are also celebrating National Voter Registration Day on Constitution Day. So this is my reminder to you. Please register to vote. Verify your registration. And of course, go out to vote. Your vote matters. At the Center, we endeavor to contribute to civic engagement efforts by hosting voter registration drives and get out the vote activities, but also by hosting these types of events as ways to encourage civic discourse and to encourage participation in our democracy. And these are efforts that are reflective of the mission of the Center. And I am pleased that you are here and that you are contributing to this effort, to this joint effort of sustaining democracy in our community and beyond. In that light, it's an honor to welcome tonight's speaker. Tonight's speaker is Sherrilyn Ifill. She, as many of you know, is a champion of civil rights, a civil rights attorney, and scholar. Ms. Ifill is the Vernon Jordan Distinguished Professor in Civil Rights at Howard University Law School, where later this year she will help to establish and launch the 14th Amendment Center for Law and Democracy. Ms. Ifill previously served as a president and director of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the nation's premier civil rights law organization fighting for racial justice and equality. Ifill's tenure at the helm of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was widely praised for elevating the profile and influence of the organization and for expanding its work across multiple areas of civil rights law. These efforts contributed greatly in shaping our national conversation about race and civil rights, which we'll talk about today, and our conversations, difficult conversations sometimes, that are much needed. Ms. Ifill has several publications in leading law journals, periodicals, and the nation's leading newspapers. Her book, On the Courthouse Lawn, Confronting the Legacy of Lynching in the 21st Century, is credited with laying the foundation for contemporary conversations about lynching and reconciliation. And she's currently working on and completing a new book about race and the current crisis in America and American democracy, titled, Is This America? I can talk a lot about her accolades and the awards that she's won, and the many great service contributions that she's made to her community, to our society, to our nation, and to our democracy. But I won't go through all those details. There's plenty of information in your program. But it is a great honor to have someone that can acknowledge and speak to the challenges that we face in our current democratic society, and speak to them in a thoughtful and intelligent and compassionate way. And so tonight, Sherrilyn will speak on a topic that is extremely important. Her talk is titled, Reimagining a New American Democracy. So with that, please join me in welcoming Sherrilyn Ifill.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming out and being here tonight. I want to extend my thanks to President Jordan and to Director O.E. and to everyone who was involved in organizing this evening. I'm really thrilled to be with you. I've never been down here before. I do love my adopted home of Maryland. I've been in Maryland now for 30 some odd years, and but I had not been down quite this far, and so I'm thrilled to be with you today. Happy Constitution Day. Happy National Voter Registration Day. And you know, the format we're going to use is I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then I'm going to sit and we're going to be in conversation. And I was thinking about what I was going to say in the 10 or so minutes that I would be before you. And since I'm at a university and it's Constitution Day, I thought I would teach a mini seminar. Is that okay? Okay, straighten up, get your mind straight, because it's coming hard, okay? Okay, so let's start here. You know, you don't even have to raise your hand. Just shout out the names of some of the founders of our nation. Adams, Jefferson, George Washington, Franklin, Madison for sure, Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton, okay. John Day, look at you. All correct, all correct. But what I want you to know is that it is striking to me that when I ask that question, no matter what room I'm in, I did this in a room of judges at the American Bar Association conference in Chicago in August, and those are the answers. No one says John Bingham, who basically drafted the 14th Amendment. No one says Thaddeus Stevens. No one says Charles Sumner. Only once have I had someone say Frederick Douglass, or Susan B. Anthony, or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or Sojourner Truth, or Mercer Langston, or so many others who were founders and framers of this republic. And what alarms me about it is that it reflects the failure of our system to convey that we actually have two constitutions. We have the original Constitution, which most of you are referring to and know about, and we have the second Constitution that was created after the Civil War. That Constitution was anchored by 3 amendments, sometimes called the Civil War Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 15th Amendment essentially said you could not deny the right to vote based on race or color. But the 14th Amendment was the centerpiece of it. And the 14th Amendment completely transformed this nation. And the country you live in is a 14th Amendment nation, not the nation that was created by the first Constitution. Many of you know that the first Constitution contained many compromises to get the job done that hot summer in Philadelphia in 1789. You know that the conflict over slavery was resolved by the decision to count enslaved black people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation. You know that in the Constitution, the original Constitution, the framers decided to continue what they called, not slavery, the word slavery never appears in the first Constitution. So we have the 3/5 compromise, which talks about 3/5 of all of other persons. And then we have the provision that allows for the importation of persons until 1808. Now, those two are significant because obviously they are provisions that relate to the condition of slavery in which hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of black people were held, both at the founding and into the 19th century. It's significant also because these were men who spoke in very clear terms, and you should be asking yourself why they didn't use the word slaves or enslaved people or slave trade. I think it's important to remember that they knew that slavery was at odds with the kind of nation they purported to be building. And that is why they referred to 3/5 of all other persons and the importation of persons rather than the slave trade. It's important because very often what we hear people say is that, well, they were men of their time and we shouldn't judge them by today's standards, but they judged themselves. They judged themselves. And they recognized that this was at odds with the nation that they were trying to create. So I get concerned when I realize that people know very little about the 14th Amendment, which actually did the work of cleaning up all of those compromises. It did the work that the first Constitution didn't do. The 14th Amendment includes so many provisions, I couldn't tell you if I had an hour lecture, I couldn't get through them all. But let's just start with the first section and just talk about a few things that are germane and relevant for the conversation I hope we'll have tonight. The first sentence of the 14th Amendment says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States shall be a citizen of the United States and the state in which they reside. All persons born or naturalized in the United States shall be a citizen of the United States and of the state in which they reside. You know this provision as birthright citizenship. Now, it's important because it's an incredibly powerful provision. Birthright citizenship was not necessarily the norm throughout the Western world during this period. You were French because your mother was French and her mother was French. But now you could be American by virtue of being born in this country or being naturalized. The purpose of birthright citizenship, the purpose of it, was to ensure the full citizenship of Black people. It was necessary to overturn the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case, in which the Supreme Court had declared and had removed the case, had dismissed the case of Dred Scott trying to get his freedom because he was in a free territory in Illinois, because they said he could not access the courts because he was not a citizen. And they went one step further and said, indeed, no Black person could be a citizen of this country. And it was the Dred Scott decision that rendered Black people in this country stateless persons. Black people both who were enslaved and also those who were free, because the court said Black people could not be citizens. So that first sentence of the 14th Amendment, providing birthright citizenship, was created to ensure that Black people would be citizens, because flowing from that citizenship would be all the rights we think of as associated with citizenship. And if I just wanted to spend a half an hour on just that one sentence, we could, because I want you to think about the transformative power of that. Not only that it rendered the millions of Black people who were enslaved and free and ensured that they were full citizens with the claim to citizenship and all that that encompasses, But many of you sitting here in this room today have grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents who came to this country, and by virtue of being naturalized, even if they didn't speak the language, if they were public charges, if they had a child here the day after they got off the boat at Ellis Island, that child was American. That one line transformed the demography of our country, of 20th century America. And so to this extent, you'd like to tell the story about your Italian great-grandparent immigrants or your Polish great-grandparent immigrants, they have the 14th Amendment, which was originally created for Black people, to thank for the benefits of birthright citizenship that did not require them to have generations here, but ensured that their family could almost immediately fully embrace being American. The lesson of that story is that when we expand rights and citizenship and equality, it always inures to the benefit of more than the people for whom it was intended. And so much of what we hear is designed to frighten us into believing that we are in a winner-take-all system, and in which, in this limited pie, if you expand opportunity for one group, it comes at the expense of another. But we could walk through the entire history, 19th and 20th century history of civil rights for Black people, and at every turn, we would discover that it expanded opportunities for white people. Last thing on the 14th Amendment, so that we can do our conversation. There's many other things. But in Section 1, you probably know that there's an equal protection clause, right? The first time the concept of equality appears in the Constitution is in the 14th Amendment. And that's important because here we are going on about the first Constitution as though it's so great, and there's some aspects of it that are absolutely great, for sure. But it's the 14th Amendment, by articulating that value of equality, that jumps over the first Constitution and back to that original document that maybe you're confusing with the first Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, in which we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It is the 14th Amendment that brings that into the Constitution, not the first Constitution. So the 14th Amendment gives us this concept of equal protection. It gives us due process for any deprivations by the state. And it also says that the privileges and immunities of citizenship are protected. But I will tell you that the first case brought under the 14th Amendment that went to the Supreme Court was a case not brought on behalf of Black people, but brought on behalf of owners of slaughterhouses in New Orleans. The case was known as the Slaughterhouse Cases. And it was the Supreme Court that essentially permitted corporations to have access to the 14th Amendment. In fact, the Supreme Court at some point then declared in the 1880s that corporations are persons for purposes of the 14th Amendment. And that's why corporations can declare that they have First Amendment rights, like in the Hobby Lobby case, or religious freedom rights, or like in Citizens United, free speech rights. Because corporations, of course, are entities of the states in which they are incorporated. And it was the Supreme Court that decided that they are persons for purposes of the Equal Protection Clause, allowing them to use this provision that was created to ensure the equality of Black people to advance corporate interests. Are you seeing what I'm saying? The idea that somehow this is a zero-sum game is a lie. I've been a civil rights lawyer for 30 years. It's all I ever wanted to do. And we are in a time of tremendous democratic crisis. I think it's important to say that. And our job in this time of democratic crisis is to figure out what our role is in bringing us to a new place. And I'm incredibly encouraged by the 14th Amendment, which is why I'm creating this center to teach people about the 14th Amendment. but also to suggest to people, just as those framers of the 14th Amendment did, that we not only have the right, we have the power and perhaps the obligation to create a new America when we find that we are broken and fractured. And so I use the 14th Amendment as tremendous inspiration. And I hope in our conversation we'll talk a little bit more about how we can do that work of reimagining a new America together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherrilyn. Thank you all for coming here and being here with us tonight to have this conversation. So we will have a few questions. I will have a few questions for Sherrilyn to start us off, and then we will open it up to conversations with everyone. We will try to get to as many folks as we can, but we'll also be mindful of time. So with that, so let me start. So thank you for your remarks on the 14th Amendment. We had some conversations about civil rights and the importance of history. We visited the commemorative for enslaved people, and really rich conversations and acknowledging the history of our past, of the location, all important. And I think when you hit on some really important points about American history. And as you were talking, I was thinking about some really important anniversaries that are coming up. 250-year anniversary of independence. Around the country we have commissions to celebrate and plan the celebrations of the 250th anniversary. We also have the 400-year anniversary of Maryland coming up. And so I think about these milestones in American history as, in some ways, feats, but also to think about, what are some of the shortcomings of our history? What are some of the ways that we have not fulfilled, not realized those tenets of the Declaration of Independence, for example. And I wonder if you could talk about these milestones in the context of this new, or imagining a new American democracy. So where is it that we've come from, and where are we going, and how do we imagine a new democratic society?
Well, thanks so much for that. I've been actually very concerned about the 250th. Because, I remember the bicentennial when I was a kid. I probably still have my bicentennial quarters and such. And I'm worried that this will be all, tall ships and tricorn hats. And so one of my desires is to make sure that the 14th Amendment is part of what we talk about. Thurgood Marshall talked about this when we had the bicentennial of the Constitution, I think it was. And, he talked about that when we celebrate the country, like we can't celebrate a static date. We have to actually celebrate the journey of how we build the country that we're still building, right? So the one anniversary that I think is worth mentioning and important is that this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which was decided May 17, 1954. And the reason I think it's important is because, I think for our generations, probably represented in this room, we kind of have come to breathe Brown like it's just air, it's just there. As though it was not critical to making this room look like it does. But I'm always mindful of it. Of the work that it took to do that. But even more so mindful of it because of the kind of democratic imagination that it took. So if you know the story, you know that, so I should first say that, civil rights struggles are not limited to any one period. They're always there, they're always happening. Sometimes they are more successful than others, but they're always happening. When Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the vice dean of Howard Law School, began developing a cadre of attorneys who he was training to believe they could be social engineers, he called it, with the goal of breaking the back of Jim Crow. There was nothing around him in 1935 or around Thurgood Marshall, who was Charles Hamilton Houston's student and who lived in segregated Baltimore and had only gone to Howard Law School because University of Maryland Law School did not admit black students at that time. There was nothing around them that would make them think that they could break the back of Jim Crow, right? So these are people who had only lived in Jim Crow. Their parents had lived in Jim Crow. Their grandparents were enslaved people. And yet, they started on this path, which they accomplished, at least in terms of the decision, in 20 years, of ending Jim Crow segregation, which was the only life they had ever known. So when we start to get whiny about what the possibilities are for our own country, the way I keep myself doing this work is that I'm mindful of those people who there was no blueprint. They weren't pointing to some other country and saying, well, we're going to try to be like England. There's nowhere that this was happening, that there was a multiracial democracy with equality at the core. That's what the 14th Amendment said, but that's not what we were doing since the 14th Amendment. We'd had Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 and a number of decisions before that that had essentially stripped the 14th Amendment of its power. That's the second part of the lecture. And it's an important part because we have to understand how promise can be snatched away, right? But the truth is that these men and women, the Pauli Murrays, the Constance Baker Motleys, the Thurgood Marshalls, the Jack Greenbergs, the Charles Hamilton Houstons, the Spotswood Robinsons, the Leon Ransoms, I mean, these were extraordinary human beings because they made up in their own mind the America they thought we could be, and then they set about a path of developing the expertise that they thought would allow them to use the law to get us there, and step by step, they actually did it. So this is the kind of anniversary I really appreciate because it is about the power of ordinary people. We're celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's nice to just have all these dates, you know, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, but I really want you to think about what it took for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to finally be enacted. It was first proposed in 1963 by John F. Kennedy in response to activism that was happening by ordinary black people in the South who were demanding equal treatment at lunch counters, in stores, and in all kinds of facilities around the country. And Kennedy tried to bring in business leaders to convince them to voluntarily desegregate and so forth, and we had the freedom rides. I mean, it was getting violent, it was ugly, and it was obvious that there wouldn't be change, and he began to believe that there needed to be legislation, which of course is what civil rights activists had been telling him for some time. So he became convinced that yes, legislation was the way. And he gave a speech on June 11th, 1963. It was a big deal. He was making a civil rights speech because John F. Kennedy had been reluctantly pushed into fully embracing civil rights. But he gave that speech. And because he was giving the speech that night, Myrlie Evers and her 2 children were up watching television when their father and husband came home, Medgar Evers, and that is how they heard him shot to death on their driveway. Medgar Evers was the field secretary in Mississippi for the NAACP, one of the most extraordinary founders and framers in our history. And so they worked all through that summer. Medgar Evers' death was a real blow. You know, Kennedy hoped he could avert with legislation the March on Washington for jobs, freedom, and justice. March on Washington actually happened and was incredibly powerful and well received. But in September, they blew up a church in Birmingham and killed 4 girls. That's September. And then what happens in November? The president is assassinated. And Lyndon Johnson, in his first speech in late November, says we have to pass this Civil Rights Act as a commemoration of President Kennedy. And after lots of back and forth and months of controversy, it passes the following year. But I just want you to think about, because sometimes we feel like we are so stressed out, and we are. We have been through something. But they went through something. They went through something, and they kept their eyes on the prize and passed these laws that make it possible for us to live as we live, that make it possible for some of us to stay in the hotels where we stay, that make it possible for us to go to the schools that we go to live the lives that we live. And I say this all the time about Brown, made it possible for so many of us, not just Black people and Latino people and Asian American people. No. All that emanated from that. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 included the provisions against employment discrimination, which is what opened up employment opportunity for women. It was 1971 when the NAACP Legal Defense Fund argued in the Supreme Court in a case called Phillips versus Martin Marietta, representing a white woman, Ida Phillips, who had applied for a job at Martin Marietta and was told she couldn't have the job because she had preschool-age children. And it was LDF that argued and won that case in the United States Supreme Court, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So if you're a woman in corporate America or you know one who has young children, tell her to say thank you to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, because that's how that happened. Do you see what I'm saying again? The collateral consequences of this, that when we embrace a vision of equality and justice, it inures to the benefit of so many more people than those for which it was originally intended. So these anniversaries help us to, to reset our minds to what is possible, because I think we become convinced that we just are powerless, but we are not, and history proves that.
Thank you. That was quite a bit there, and really insightful, because it really focuses on how we have agency and we have the power to influence the course of events in our history. You talk about the power of people, ordinary people, making significant impacts in our country, in our society, but also the role of institutions and the courts ruling in ways to help advance the cause of civil rights, along with leaders showing leadership and advancing the cause of civil rights. But in today's age, it seems like our court system has gone in the opposite direction, and our leaders have, in many ways, not shown leadership in those areas. Is this a crisis of leadership in our institutions, or what are we experiencing today?
I think that's a good way to put it. I think we are. I think we are experiencing a crisis of leadership in our institutions. Democracies are not just strong because of people. And I do think that sometimes we put too much pressure on ordinary people. You know, listen, it's National Voter Registration Day. You must vote. I've been a voting rights attorney for 30 years. You have to be registered. Everyone in your house has to be registered. Everyone in your dorm room has to be registered. Your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your significant other, they have to be registered to vote, or you shouldn't be seeing them. There we go. There we go. Okay, we have a great volunteer right here. Like, let's just get real. Then you have to vote. Then you have to actually turn out. You got to early vote or absentee vote or in-person vote or however you're going to do it. Then when you vote, you have to vote the whole ballot. Let me say it again. Then when you vote, you have to vote the whole ballot. You know when it says pick 3 judges? And you don't know who they are? Yeah, it's time out for that. We now need to get very serious about voting. And don't scold other people about voting when you don't vote the whole ballot. If you're not voting in the sheriff elections and you see what some of these sheriffs are doing around the country, yeah. If you're upset about what's happening on school boards and book bannings, well, you didn't vote in the school board election. You didn't run for school board. So yes, I do believe that ordinary people are being called to a higher level of citizenship, and I talk about this in my book. But I also, at the same time, believe that democracies are undergirded by strong institutions. And it's very fashionable to critique institutions, and maybe that's some of the reason that we have allowed so many of our institutions to be degraded. What are the institutions that undergird a healthy democracy? Well, universities are one. Is there a healthy democracy without strong universities? I don't know one. The rule of law and the legal system, critical. If that falls, democracy falls. But there are other institutions as well. The business community, media, all of these are critical institutions that have to undergird a strong and healthy democracy. And our democracy right now is unhealthy. And it is largely unhealthy because of the degradation of those institutions. Now, I'm not saying anything I don't say to my colleagues. I've sat on a million task forces. I'm on the ABA task force on democracy. It's on the task force on justice. And because I like to speak to my own profession about our shortcomings and what we have to do to get stronger. I do think there's a crisis in the Supreme Court. And these are all crises of leadership. So maybe we should talk a little bit about what leadership means, right? Because leadership is not an easy thing. Everybody wants to be a leader. Nobody wants to be a leader. Everybody wants to be a leader because they think that being a leader means that you're in charge. But being in charge is a huge responsibility. And it means you don't put yourself first. Sometimes you can't even put your own perspective, your own view first. It means you have to listen. It means you have to be able to absorb dissent. It means you have to be able to allow yourself to be challenged. It means you have to compromise. Leadership means sometimes that you don't compromise. And to be a leader is knowing the difference between when you do and when you don't, right? Being a leader is being excellent in your field. Being a leader means that there's nothing beneath you. There may be things you won't do, but not because it's beneath you. Being a leader means putting your people first. Being a leader means putting the institution before yourself. And I'm going to tell you, as someone who led the Legal Defense Fund for a decade, an institution I loved, where I really started my legal career, and that's always been my professional home. Even as I sit here right now and I'm a professor at Howard Law School, I still feel like that's where I work. It's not easy. It's not easy to do what's necessary for your staff, to listen to multiple voices, to be criticized, to take the flak, to be out front, to be the person who gets the threats, to be the person who has to protect their team and protect their staff, to be the person who has to step into the gap and ensure that the voices of those who are marginalized are heard, to think about the consequences of your actions, and to be fair. It's not easy, actually, to be fair. This is what I kind of like about the law, because the rules are supposed to make it fair. So part of my critiques of this current majority on the Supreme Court are really twofold. I'll leave aside the ethical, well, maybe not. In a case called Offutt versus the United States in 1954, the Supreme Court actually said, justice must satisfy the appearance of justice. Justice must satisfy the appearance of justice. And what the court meant is that you have a right to due process. Do you know what due process is? Due process of law means that before you can be deprived of something, there are certain things that have to happen. So let's say someone just comes and puts you in prison, not jail, prison, for a crime that they think you committed. You would raise, habeas corpus, you would demand, your due process rights. Due process is like knowing what the charges against you are, an opportunity to be heard before an impartial tribunal, the right to confront the witnesses against you, right? These are things that you would expect. You haven't even thought about it because that's what you would expect, right? Because that's how our legal system works. But those things are due process, right? Imagine if you're in school and you're going to get suspended, right? You know, you all have hearings, you have disciplinary boards, you have all of those things that we create before we take something away from someone are what we think of as due process. And due process is critically important. So justice must satisfy the appearance of justice meant not only must there be due process, not only must it be true that you appear before an impartial tribunal, but it also has to look like it. Justice must satisfy the appearance of justice. That even when there's not actual bias, if a reasonable person would have a hard time believing that you could be impartial in that circumstance, it can be just as corrosive. And that's why we have rules about judicial recusal, the need for judges to remove themselves from hearing a case in which there, as the statute says, impartiality might be reasonably questioned, right? So if, you know, if I'm on this, I'm a judge, I think we have a judge here, there's a magistrate I thought I met earlier, and your son appears before you, that would be a problem. Maybe you're not even biased towards your son. Maybe you're like, you know what? He needs to learn a lesson, right? And I'm just the guy to give it to him. Maybe that's what you're thinking, but it doesn't matter because everyone else thinks that's your son. And we're degrading public confidence in the justice system by having you decide on the case of your son. So for that reason, we have rules, and we have ethical rules that are supposed to contain the conduct of judges so that justice will satisfy not only the fact of impartiality, but also the appearance of it. So these ethical scandals that we're seeing of justices who've gone on lavish vacations and are having glacial martinis up in Alaska, and I can just only tell you that I've known a lot of judges in my life, and judges don't do this. They don't. So that's a problem. That's a real problem. The second thing that's more problematic for me is I was sharing with you earlier, or with Bridget from the school newspaper, that in law school I loved civil procedure, which is the rules of litigation. And I was saying it's the first year law school subject that most confounds law students because they don't know anything about it. You know, they know something about criminal law, they know something about constitutional law, they know something about torts, even though they don't know it's called torts, but they don't know civil procedure, they don't know the rule. Why would they? And I also did not know anything about it when I went to law school, and for the first 2 weeks I had no idea what was going on. I had the highlighter and I would highlight like every line in the book because I didn't know what. And then week 3, we were doing a particular case and the light bulb just turned. I just got the whole thing. It made sense. And I became like the civil procedure star in my section, you know. I had the answers to all the questions, and I became the teaching assistant for the professor the following year, and I ended up teaching civil procedure for 20 years at University of Maryland Law School. And I love it because it's the rules of litigation. I always feel like that's our job as lawyers, to master the rules. To master the rules so we can navigate getting our clients to the point where they can tell their story. I can't tell my client's story better than they can tell their story. But I'm not allowed to tell their story. I gotta get them on the stand to tell the story, right? So I got to figure out how to overcome a motion to dismiss, how to overcome a motion for summary judgment, how to deal with a motion in limine, how to deal with the objections that may happen to their testimony. That's my job. So I love that. And what I see with this Supreme Court is, I should say, the thing I love most about it is the rules are the same. Whether the litigants are black or white, rich or poor, Southern or Northern, the federal rules of civil procedure apply to us all, and that's what I like about it. If you just tell me the rules of the game, I can win. I'm not even that worried about whether the judge is conservative or liberal because we've won lots of civil rights cases in front of conservative judges. But what I see increasingly with this court is a changing of the rules in midstream, and that I don't like. So that's one thing that is deeply problematic. And then the other thing is being a leader means thinking about the consequences of your decisions. And when I see a Supreme Court that makes the kinds of decisions, some of which you know, have been made over the last few years without regard or even discussion of the consequence, the Dobbs decision. We just saw this young woman in Georgia who died of sepsis. Or even the affirmative action decision, or no real guidance for people to figure out how to actually do this thing. Because you're a Supreme Court justice, you can say whatever you want. And the rest of us scurry around and figure out how to deal with it. But I think real leaders, you may recall in Brown, there were two decisions. It was Brown 1 and Brown 2, 1954 and 1955. 1954 was the decision saying that separate but equal is unconstitutional. And what the court said was, we're going to hold off until next year to figure out how this would be implemented. And there was a whole year, there was oral arguments, and then in 55 was Brown 2. Now, I didn't like the Brown 2 decision, don't get me wrong. But the concept, right, of, okay, how's this going to work, is a leadership concept. It's not enough to just pronounce, right? And so that's what I'm seeing with this court. And all of those things are contriving to diminish public confidence in the court and in the judiciary. And that's a bad thing, because, you know, we obey the decisions of courts because we respect them as courts and we understand how critical the rule of law is to democracy, not because they are threatening us in any way, but just because that's what we do. And I've lost a lot of cases. And when I lose the case, I'm really not happy. And I think the judge got it wrong, and that's the end of it. We have to comply with it. I don't, right? And we move on to the next strategy, or we move on to the next case or idea, or we hunker down with our clients and help them figure out how they're going to manage in light of the new legal landscape. That's what we do. It's that level of respect, even when you just absolutely know they're wrong. And but you have to earn that respect. And so it is worrisome, what we're seeing.
I agree, and as someone who studies public confidence in democracy, I see that in our country and around the world. And that's something that I wanted to ask you is, we see this crisis in democracy, as you noted, in this country with our institutions, but also with our leaders. But it's also something that's ubiquitous across the world. 2/3 of the regimes or countries and their political systems around the world are non-democratic. Over 2/3 of the world's population lives in countries that are non-democratic. And so this is a real global phenomenon. And so I think about this. My students, they hear me go on and on about this. You know, how do we turn the tide? Well, first of all, we have to identify the problem. And I think you've done that. But how do we turn the tide? How do we stop this democratic decline or this backsliding or this erosion? What is to be done?
Yeah, we are in a global moment, and that makes this even more dangerous, an even more dangerous moment than perhaps in the past. You know, democracy has to work. It has to work for people to have confidence in it. And so I think the vast inequality that we see in democracies around the world meant that they would not be sustainable. It's only so long that people will tolerate that level of inequality. And so I think it's weakened us because it's hard. It becomes hard to make the case, right? And as people move further away from the experience of the threat of global authoritarianism, as we move away from World War II and Nazism, and you know, the memory fades, and it doesn't become something real anymore to imagine what that might feel like, you know, on a day-to-day basis. And so it makes the populations vulnerable to the strong man who says, you know, the problem is we waste too much time talking. You know, we just got to do things. No, I don't want to hear any dissent. I know what's best, right? It makes people vulnerable to that kind of presentation. But I do think we're in a unique position in this country, because if we fall, so many others will fall. But if we ever get this thing right, If we ever pull off being a major world power that is a multiracial democracy with the character and identity at its center of equality and justice, wow. That's the goal. That's the goal. We have all the apparatus that could make that happen. But that's what I'm working for. I'm working for that here. The effect of that, the domino effect of that on nations around the world would be extraordinary. And the problem is too many people have given up on the possibility of us being able to create that. We may be the only generation who believes we have the God-given right to see the outcomes we want in our lifetime. Our grandparents didn't. They worked, they labored every day. Our great-grandparents, they got on ships for places. I mean, I would move to another country, but I would have to have a house and a health plan, a car. I mean, think about it. And these strange, peculiar people got on boats and planes and just immigrated here from wherever they came from Europe, from Central America. Or your forebears were enslaved and worked as sharecroppers and moved in the Great Migration up to the north, constantly looking for a better way. Or the Thurgood Marshalls and the Charles Hamilton Houstons dreaming of a new America and creating it. Or those civil rights activists who put their bodies on the line at a lunch counter in a bus coming into Anniston, Georgia, with a mob waiting to beat the holy heck out of you. That endured the loss of those 4 little girls, that endured the beating on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That's our pedigree. That's what we come from. And maybe we just got comfy and hoped, I don't blame us, we hoped we wouldn't have to do all of that. But what if we do have to? How many people in here have grandchildren? You ever look in their face and feel like you can say, I did my best, it's on you now? That's not it. That's not it. And even for young people, people like to say, well, the young people are going to save us. Well, the young people always do because they grow up and they become old people. But the point is that I think our young people are so uncompromising in some of the best ways, really demanding in some of the absolute best ways. But that does not let adults off the hook. Because our kids actually have been through a lot. These have been some tumultuous years. And they need time to build their resilience back. We don't have the right to just throw our hands up to kids that we subjected to, shooter drills. We still owe them. So we still have to keep at it, and we have to keep working in our own way, whatever is our way. But when you're in a time of democratic crisis, then we step up as citizens. We step up as institutions. That's what we do. We don't just lament. We realize that something more is required of us. Maybe we thought it was okay to just sally forth every 4 years and vote and feel great, put the pin on, I voted. Maybe that was good enough. It's not good enough anymore. Can we deal with that? Can we deal with the fact that after this year there will be elections next year, and are you going? They'll be like municipal elections, right? They'll be for the sheriff or the Public Service Commission, or there'll be like a ballot initiative. Are you going to that election, or you just, that's not good, doesn't merit your time? That's how we've been. I'm talking about those of us who are like active and engaged citizens. That's how we've been doing it. Turns out it's not good enough. So I'm asking all of us to turn on the citizen thing in us that requires more, and to not give up on the possibility that we could create this thing. But I can assure you it won't be created unless we have decided that we're gonna keep playing the game. We're gonna stay in. We're gonna ask the dealer to do another round. But if we want to just throw in the cards, then it's definitely never gonna happen. And there will be consequences. There will be people who will suffer. Maybe you'll be okay. Maybe you'll be okay. But maybe your next door neighbor won't, and maybe you'll have to watch what happens to them. So I just encourage us in this time to feel our power to not throw in the towel and feel like there's nothing we can do, and also at the same time to admit that whatever we've been doing, we have to do more. It doesn't have to be the same things, it could be different things. If you've never shown up at a school board meeting, how about it? Why not? There's nothing to stop you. A city council meeting, town council, mayor, when your congressperson comes through their town hall, do you do any of that? You can't call your senator once a month? Probably you can. You can text them. You can tag them on social media. I think we can do more. So that's what I'm hoping we will do.
Thank you. I think at a minimum, we need to talk and talk about democracy and talk about politics. You know, so many times when we have conversations about politics with folks, it gets confrontational, but to have a peaceful and open conversation about our political system, our processes, our democracy is important.
And having them at universities is important.
Absolutely. I think you and I can talk for hours on end, but
We could.
I think there are folks who want to ask some questions. So if you have a question, we have some student volunteers that have microphones that we'll be running them up and down the aisle. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Wait until the microphone reaches you so we can all hear you, and you can deliver your question. It's best not to give a long introduction to your question, rather just get to the point, and then we will have a moment for Sherrilyn to respond. I think we have a question down here in the front. And also, please be mindful and respectful of our community with your questions and responses. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to the Southern Maryland. I went to St. Mary's many years ago, and one of the things I really never paid attention to was the statue of the tolerance that greets you over there by the sailing community. And it really, you know, you walk by these things and you don't really think about what they mean. And so I've been inspired more recently by that. Also, this is going to be my first night. If anybody wants to register to vote, this is my debut. I've got all the forms here. But is the vote the most important thing right now?
Yeah, I don't think we have to rank them. I don't think we have to rank them. We do know that it is critical and essential that we vote, absolutely. But I don't believe that it is the only way to make change happen. You know, think about the change that civil rights activists made happen when they couldn't vote.
Worried about Project 2025.
You should be worried about Project 2025. So, yeah, so the vote is essential for sure. But there are other things that have to happen too. We have to show up, we have to protest, we have to be active, we have to educate ourselves, we have to disseminate information, we have to do all the things. I mean, if we just all vote and then go back into our homes, look, we're all here tonight, you know. Let's suppose we all vote. That doesn't mean tonight has no value to our thinking about democracy and undergirding ourselves. So I just think there's so many elements to it, keeping each other encouraged, you know, that are just really important.
What I've been doing is having conversations, like Kamala says, one-on-one, talking to people. So my story, my mother grew up in Nazi Germany, and she did have family members that were sent to concentration camps because their neighbor turned them in. And so it's a very real thing. And when I get people to kind of listen a little bit more about this dictatorship, which frankly terrifies me, and a lot of people around me. So I mean, I agree with the vote, and we are, you know, engaged in the community and doing one-on-one door knocking, all this sort of thing. But I don't know if some people don't realize. To me, it seems the most important thing, this election, but I tell them it's like everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question down here at the front.
So my question is about strategic approach. I was one of those people studying out of Jack Greenberg's book in the 1980s, and we thought we were moving in the right direction with all sorts of discrimination cases. But at the same time, there was this little group called the Federalist Society, and we didn't pay any attention to them. They were sort of fringe, they were kind of bizarre conservatives. But the Federalist Society had a strategy, and part of where we are right now is the judges who are sitting in the courts who were cultivated by the Federalist Society. So my question is, beyond those of us in this room who are very active politically in terms of voting and door knocking, what would you recommend as sort of the go-to place, the organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that are thinking about a longer game? Because where we, quote unquote, we tend to lose is where the other side really has a very careful plan. Not a concept of a plan, but a plan.
Excellent, excellent question. Excellent.
And they succeed, and we seem to be thrown back on our heels.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, so first of all, excellent, I agree. And one of the things I think has just been really exciting, certainly for me, is to just see how many people have now been shaken into thinking more strategically and thinking outside the box. You know, there's a whole section of my book that's about how how anti-democratic measures are basically workshopped on black communities before they are kind of premiered. And so knowing what understanding the early warning signs are really important, and using that information. But to your point, organizations, protect democracy, fantastic. The Brennan Center for Justice, fantastic. Center for American Progress, fantastic. Obviously, the Legal Defense Fund. These are all organizations that are just strategizing about judges, about Senate, about, I mean, there's a lot of, when I was saying that we need institutional change, you know, we need to change the rules that keep our voice from being heard even if we vote, right? So we have to deal with the filibuster. We have to deal with the Supreme Court and the structure and what is allowed to happen. All of these things happen because, and I don't know why people get so bent out of shape about it. That's what you're supposed to do. You have experiences, you learn what doesn't work, or you learn where the vulnerabilities are, and then you make change. And that's always been what we've done. But for some reason, every time we talk about making change now, it's turned into some like catastrophic thing. So all of these organizations are working on theories of how we change our political institutions to allow the voice of people to get through, because that's what's happening. It's not the number of people, it's not even the people voting, is that the structures from gerrymandering to the filibuster and electoral college and all these things have been created in ways that suppress the voice and the vote of people. So there's a lot of work that people are doing in that regard. And I have to say, maybe the most I've seen, if there's one thing that the last 8 years have done, is that they have shaken awake those who thought that this kind of thing was beneath them. And I've just seen that transformation of people to understand the kind of drastic measures that are necessary if you're serious about not just saving, but strengthening democracy.
I think we had a hand up here on the side. Was it there in the back?
I was just curious if you thought that the Dobbs decision would lead to like overturning of Loving and Obergefell and others like that.
Well, that's what Clarence Thomas said. So just this past Monday, was it last week Monday? Last week Monday. Today's Tuesday, right? Yeah. Okay, last week Monday. Justice Kagan, Elena Kagan, came to do a talk with Melissa Murray, who you may know is a professor at NYU Law School and one of the women who does the Strict Scrutiny podcast and an expert on reproductive rights. And they did a conversation at NYU Law School, which is my alma mater, and I'm on the board of NYU Law School. And she was asked that question. And she said, I certainly think that that is the logical consequence of the majority's, obviously she dissented in the Dobbs case, of the majority's decision in that case. And she referenced, you know, Clarence Thomas essentially inviting those challenges, right? If what you're saying is that there is no history and tradition of liberty that is associated with reproductive rights, then, and the date that we're working with is 1868 or before, right? When the 14th Amendment was ratified, then there certainly was no history and tradition of interracial marriage. There was no history and tradition of gay marriage. So, yeah, I think we're looking at those things potentially being in peril.
Thank you for that question. Question right over here, sir.
Thank you and good night. I think I have a two-part question about the 14th Amendment. I grew up in a segregated environment where in a time where that don't exist anymore, which is a canal zone. And so growing up in the canal zone, most of us thought we were US because of the freedoms we had, style of growing up. I say freedom meaning that we were free to move around except certain places. Some communities could, some couldn't. But one of the things that we always thought that being born in the canal zone meant that we should have been US. 14th Amendment clearly states that if you're born in the canal zone, rather in the United States, canal zone was the United States, it was a territory. And my parents were the first generation that were born there. They weren't given citizenship at a time when basically they were stateless because they weren't Panamanians, they weren't US, nor were they British, which their parents were British citizens. So the things that, the questions that I'm getting to is, so a territory is the United States. Is it the United States? And the other thing is, should we have been recognized as US citizens, natural-born US citizens?
It's interesting, such an interesting question, because now there was segregation in the canal zone, as I recall, okay? Yeah, and people like John McCain was born in the canal zone. Of course, he was born to American parents, American citizen parents. There's a set of cases called the insular cases, which many of us have called for the court to overturn, that basically left and continues to leave people in United States territories as second-class citizens, whether it's Puerto Rico, Guam, other places as well, and that still has to be addressed. But I agree with you. I think if you were born in a U.S. territory, you should be a U.S. citizen. That would have to be litigated, and I'm not sure I'd want this particular court to get their hands on that yet, until there's some Supreme Court reform. But obviously, if you're born in the canal zone to American parents, you are a citizen. But that was not extended to those whose parents were not American citizens. You had a second question, though. That was the second. Thank you. Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you.
Great, thank you, sir. Question right here in the center.
Good evening, Ms. Ifill. My question to you is, what strategies do you suggest for first-time voters or other voters in their 20s who are quite frankly dismayed between both of our options in this presidential election? Speaking from my daughter and my daughter's friends that I listen to, they're not comfortable with either of our candidates. And some of their friends have said, and because I'm not comfortable, I will not vote. what strategies do you have? What advice would you recommend?
Thank you for that question. Thank you so much. Wait, now, so I'm just thinking back at this. Maybe protectorate? Maybe that's how they describe the canal zone as a... Yeah.
To take out a passport,
Yeah.
they were told that that at the time the canal zone wasn't a territory. That's what we were.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think the word may have been protector. I'm trying to think, or military zone. It was some other. It wasn't described as legally as a territory.
They used another term. They used was that unincorporated.
Was it what?
Unincorporated territory.
Oh, okay. Well, that's still a territory. But okay. Anyway, you've got me curious, and now I have to do some research and figure that one out. Ma'am, yes, excellent question. Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of the disillusionment of young people. It's just not strategic to say that. It's just simply not. What we are always fighting for in a presidential election, in my view, is breathing room to do the things we need to do, which really are not at the presidential level, to make transformative change. And, you know, I have kids too who, you know, have expressed over many years, you know, concerns about choices in presidential elections. And what I've explained to them is, and now speaking just as a black person, you know, I tell my daughters, maybe because your formative experience voting for president was that you were voting for Obama, who you really liked and who you thought was cool and handsome and really like you felt him. That's not how the presidential election works. These were not people that we really liked who were like us and who were young. That's not the president, right? So it's like we weren't really just like, oh my God, I just love Michael Dukakis. Oh, John Kerry is so great. Like that wasn't it. That wasn't how we understood the presidency to be something else. You know, this is not your councilman. It's not your mayor even that you may really feel passionately about. You want to work with him on critical issues in your community. That's not it. The presidency is at a different level, and it's at the level where you're voting when they say, oh, we're tired of voting for the lesser of two evils. It's always the lesser of two evils. What are you talking about? Like, that's what it is. So I think that it's an unfortunate reality, but I think it's gotten skewed just because for many of these young people, their formative presidential voting experience made them feel good. They felt good about who they were voting for. You know? They liked him. And they thought that's what presidents look like, you know, and are like. But they're not. People get upset when I say, you know, presidents are always responsible for killing people. I mean, I know that sounds terrible. But the president's the commander-in-chief, and he orders all kinds of things to happen, or we haven't had that yet, but that's, you know, when people say, oh, you should run for, that's why I wouldn't want to be president. I'm not ordering nothing, right? They're gonna do that. That's gonna happen. And so I just think it's understanding levels of power and political engagement. And it's in some ways our fault because we present the presidential election as the gold standard. When in fact, I think, for example, in this presidential election, if, for example, the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris were to win, but not have the House and the Senate, I don't see how does that work? So she's impeached by June, you know, by Jim Jordan and the other folks who would control the House. She can't confirm any of her cabinet nominees because of the Senate. She can't get judges on because of the Senate. You see what I'm saying? So I think because we present it like it's the president and then everything's gonna happen one way or another way, that's really not how it works. It really is all these pockets of power. And you can disagree profoundly with the president on many things. I think about FDR. FDR left black people out of the New Deal, right? When they created Social Security, he negotiated with the Southern segregationists who wanted and demanded essentially that we be left out. And how are we left out? It didn't say black people are left out, but it left out domestic and agricultural workers, which is what we were in the 1930s, for the most part. Majority of black people lived in the South then, still live in, the majority of black people still live in the South. So it's never, at least for us as black people, if I can just, just say, we're 13% of the population. So at the macro level, unless we're combining with other people, our power is fairly limited. But what the presidency does is it gives you the breathing room to be able to do the other things that you want to do to make change, right? Because the change is still going to happen from all of the circumstances that happen in the House, in the Senate, in your city, in your county, in your state. All of that's going to emanate. It's going to release some dollars that allow some infrastructure in your community that can get, some infrastructure for schools, that allow you to get your water pipes fixed. And it's going to allow you, right? So dollars are important. It's going to allow some things. You're not going to agree on everything. And it's a decision everyone has to make for themselves. I do think that not voting is not really the answer. I just don't. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't look at myself and not vote. But I also think it's profoundly personal, And I don't think we're really in a position to harangue young people. They've gotten a kind of raw deal over the past few years. I really do feel that way. I just feel like we haven't made this thing look like it can work. And, there are other channels. If you're a young person and you don't want to vote, but you've joined this community group and you work on this issue, I want you to vote, for sure. But you better be doing something. You better be doing something.
Thank you. I think we have a question right here in the back.
Yeah, you brought up considerations about the Supreme Court and direction that it's been taking to date. Realistically, what can be done to bring forth ethical reform with the Supreme Court? Realistically, yeah.
Well, you need the House and the Senate. I think people also don't realize that Congress has the power over the Supreme Court under the Constitution, under Article 1 and Article 3. It's Congress that has that power. Congress has the power to set how many justices there are. We haven't always had 9. We've had 6. We've had 8. We had 10. Andrew Johnson, wanted to appoint 2 justices to the court and wanted to appoint 1 justice to the court. I think he wanted his attorney general to be on the court. Congress got so mad they just eliminated 2 seats. I mean, this has happened before. I know everybody wants to, oh my gosh, FDR, court packing, it almost happened, the switch in 9, the save 9, all of that stuff. But it's not written anywhere, the number of justices. It is Congress that has the power. Congress has the power to set their salaries. Congress has the power to decide how many justices there are. Congress has the power to determine their jurisdiction. What cases they hear, with the exception of a few that are laid out in the Constitution. So the reason I'm saying this is because your question sounds like how I often hear the question, as though it's such a far-fetched thing, like how could it really happen? Yeah, it could really happen. If the House and the Senate would vote to expand the Supreme Court, that would be it. There are people who believe that we could impose term limits, and I think I've become convinced that that is also possible. So the Constitution does provide for lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices, but there is a way of creating a senior status kind of stacking of justices so that you would not be stripped of being a Supreme Court justice, but you wouldn't be on the active docket. And what's the benefit of that plan? It's again a plan developed by some of these organizations that I was referring to earlier. There would be 18-year terms, and basically the way it would work out mathematically is that every president would get 2 appointments. And that would dial down the kind of political gamesmanship and fear that you won't get any appointments if, you're the president or your party has the presidency. So yes, it is possible. And, I'm sorry, and an ethics code. Congress could also pass an ethics code.
If I may piggyback on that, how does the ABA feel about it? The American
The
Bar
ABA feel about which one?
the Supreme Court issue.
Well, the Supreme Court's a big issue. How do they feel about the components of it? Yes, the ABA thinks there should be an ethical code. Has the ABA opined on whether the court should be expanded? I do not think they have. Yeah, I don't think they have. I can tell you just from, you know, conversations with folks in the ABA, I think everyone knows that it's at a critical moment. The ABA doesn't have the same power that it did in the past because, like everything, it's become viewed through the lens of partisan politics. But yeah, so I don't think they have issued a statement yet saying that, because I'm sure many of its members practice in the Supreme Court and feel nervous about saying such a thing. But I think it's becoming more and more normalized to the point that it will and it can and I believe will happen, but only happens if the House and the Senate are so inclined.
Right. So we have another question. A quick question, and then we'll have some closing remarks.
Good evening. Thank you for coming down south to see us guys down here. I appreciate it. Quick question, two parts. I've been studying the Constitution lately, specifically the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Been more attention into that. First part of the question is Electoral College. As old as that's been around, as long as it's been around, is there anybody going to take this thing up and take a look at it and see what the what could be done to either ratify it or do something to it? I don't know, just take a good hard look at it. The second one is, we're probably the most unique country on planet Earth. I did 22 years in the Navy, retired commander. I've been all over the world. There is no other country like America, none. And to keep this democracy on track, the second part of this question is, you talked about the 14th Amendment. Could it be used, and I'll coin this phrase, as a nuclear option to make sure we stay on track as a democracy?
What's the nuclear option?
The 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment.
Which part? Which part?
There's a lot to it.
Okay. First part of your question, Electoral College, hot mess. Again, all these compromises in the first Constitution to make sure that states with small population would have power, and all of this stuff has come back to bite us. Once again, I think you experiment, you try it, it doesn't work. It's actually silencing a majority of the popular vote and needs to be changed. We would need a constitutional amendment to change it because it is in the Constitution. However, there are people who are working incredibly hard on the National Popular Vote Initiative, and that is getting a number of states to have their own state ballot initiatives that agree that they will allocate all of their electoral college votes to the winner of the popular vote in their state. They need, in order for this to become effective, you would need to have enough states that would add up to 270 electoral votes. I think right now it's at 207. And so you could, go online and look it up. And so there are these efforts to try to get more states to pass the National Popular Vote Initiative, so that once you reach that critical mass, then you would have enough states where the electoral college votes would be allocated by popular vote based on these state referenda. That's the first part. The second part about the 14th Amendment, well, there is one nuclear option, and that's in Section 2. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment says, and one of the reasons I love it is because the framers of the 14th Amendment were very aware. They studied, they sent emissaries down south, not this down south, but really down south, and to find out what was going on. And what they discovered was that there were two things that worried them about the future of this new country they were trying to create. One was the spirit of insurrection, which seemed to still exist and seemed to be endemic, right? They said, treason hardly seems something wrong to them. And the second was, the ongoing power of white supremacy and how whites, particularly in the South, basically were looking for any way to continue their domination. And we're not likely to give in on that. So the 14th Amendment does two things designed to address that. Section 2, which is the nuclear option that I was referring to, says, therefore, and remember, the 15th Amendment hasn't been ratified yet, so we don't have, you can't stop people from voting based on race, which they did stop people from voting based on race anyway until 1965. Anyway, but the Section 2 of the 14th Amendment says that essentially any state that prohibits black men who are 21 years old, because remember, we don't have a 19th Amendment yet, so women still can't vote, 18-year-olds can't vote, so it says black male, 21 years or older, any state that denies them the vote will have their representation reduced by the number of black male potential voters they disenfranchise. Now, I like it. We've never used it, but I'm into it, right? Especially since they're whittling away the Voting Rights Act. I'm feeling like, well, that's how we can do voter suppression. Let's do it. So that's one nuclear option. The second nuclear option, unfortunately, took a blow. I told you they found two things: ongoing white supremacy, spirit of insurrection. Spirit of insurrection they dealt with in Section 3. And you may know of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The only reason anyone knows about it, including the people who were litigating it, is because there was this effort to keep former President Trump off the ballot because of the provisions of Section 3, which says that anyone who formally took an oath of office, that is anyone who took an oath to the Constitution or to the state constitution, and participated in insurrection, cannot serve at either the state or the federal level. That was the basis of the lawsuit to keep Trump off the ballot that Colorado litigated. And essentially what the Supreme Court said was, well, that was a really long time ago, and we can't really do that, and that, what? That's crazy. Congress would need to give us another statute, even though it says it right there in the Constitution. So again, just to show you that unless you do something about the Supreme Court, even the nuclear option gets neutralized. Sorry to end on that note.
Thank you. So we are nearly out of time, but I wonder if you can give some brief final remarks to our students in particular about, you know, how to set yourself up to have a distinguished career like you have had, and you're continuing to make a significant impact, but what are some words of wisdom for our students?
Well, this is an undergraduate school, so they should be having fun. I really think that's important. I think, and I thought learning things was fun too. So, you know, taking courses that are not necessarily in your major, learning how to do things, but having a good time with your friends and learning something about the world. If you have the opportunity to go abroad, please do it. Really, just enjoy this time. And I don't think you should be thinking about having a distinguished career. I think you should be thinking about doing work of great meaning. And I've always just loved doing work where I know what I'm doing is good. Do you know what I mean? It's, you know, when you're exhausted and when you're discouraged, when you feel the pulls, especially as a woman, of your family and your work and all of that, the knowledge of the work that you're doing is good work. You know, is work designed to bring good things to people's life, work designed to make your country better, make your community better. It just can't be beat. It just can't be beat, you know. I you know, was not paid a lot when I started out lawyering. It was hard. But I just thought that was part of it. The joy to get to do the thing I had dreamed of doing when I was a little girl, it never occurred to me that I should not do it. So I think it's just finding really what your passion is and doing it, but believing that part of your job is to contribute as a citizen to this democracy. You're getting things from it. You may be mad about your presidential choices, but you're living in a democracy. You're at this nice institution. You're getting on whatever transportation you want to get on. You're doing what you want to do. This didn't just come out of the sky. Some people did this. And so I think it's important to understand that you have an obligation as well. And I would just say one last thing for those people who think they're not going to vote, you know, in the president's race. You better go. You don't have an excuse for the other races on the ballot. So you can't be home on election day, and you can't be not registered, because we have a Senate race in this state. We have sheriff races and judicial races. We have school board races. There's a ballot initiative about abortion on the ballot. Like, I don't know what they mean. I mean, I'm not going to know what you do when you get in the booth, but if you decide you don't want to vote on that top election, you don't have any excuse for not voting on the others. So don't let any of your children be in the house and telling you they're not voting. That's their business. The ballot is a long thing. It's got all kinds of stuff on it. So get in that booth, and then we'll see what happens. Maybe you'll skip it and maybe you won't. But you better do the others. That's the thing. It's not all or nothing. But this idea that the presidential election is the only election is what has us believing that elections only happen every 4 years, and it's what has this kind of, I'm not going to vote. Like, that's not a thing, not voting. If you don't, I mean, some of us don't vote. Some of us go in the booth. We see the candidates. It says pick 3 judges. We don't know any of them, and then we just skip it. So you didn't vote for one of the races either. Some of you just didn't know who the DA candidates were, so you just skipped it. But you got to get in that booth. And I pray you'll be convicted when you get in that booth to vote the entire ballot. But you don't have any excuse. You can't, so all of those people, you hate them all. No, come on. Come on. That's not credible. So they got to come out and vote for something.
Thank you. Before we close tonight, I want to invite you all to a follow-up discussion on civil rights. In 2 weeks' time, we will have a panel discussion on civil rights in Southern Maryland. And so this will be a collaboration of St. Mary's College, Historic St. Mary's City, and Historic Sauderly Plantation. Take place here October 1st at 7 p.m. Thank you, Sherrilyn, for a wonderful conversation, very insightful, and very much appreciated. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Have a good evening.